Hey, my name is Eric, and today I'm going to try to build a Christmas tree serving platter. Let's give it a go. Okay, with our goals in mind, let's get to our concept. So this project is going to start with our raw board, which we're going to get to about 1 inch in thickness. And then ultimately we're going to cut this board into strips of about 1.5 inches per. Then we're going to take those strips, glue them back together to make our serving tray. So why cut a board into strips only to glue it back together? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The first has to do with the stability of the board over a period of time. Most long grains on a board will run in a certain direction, and as that board heats up, as it gets wet, as it dries off, as it cools, over time that board could cup or warp based on the direction of that grain. So by cutting that board into strips, those multiple strips will ultimately pull against each other and ideally keep the board nice and flat. So at the end of the day, we'll have a whole bunch of strips working with each other to keep that board nice and level. Secondly, from an aesthetic point of view, I think the pattern is a little bit nicer once finished. Okay, let's talk about how we're going to take our board and take material out to give us that lip on the side of the piece. So we'll take our board and turn it on its side. And then the cut we're looking for is going to ideally give us an angle that looks like this, with all of this material here removed. So in order to do that, I'm going to use a router bit that has that angle that I'm looking for. That router bit is going to be attached to a bearing, and that bearing is going to need to ride flush against our template, which is going to be in the shape of a Christmas tree. So part of this project will be making that template. And that should be fairly simple. We're just going to take a piece of plywood, put our Christmas tree shape onto it, and then cut it out. We can then take that template, put it on top of our board, and that'll give us our pattern to cut our tree. But before we do that, we got to talk about decorations. So I want to focus on 2 types, garland and lights. My idea for garland was originally to cut this board straight across, put in some wooden inserts, and have that be our garland. But I realized that will be garland going straight across a tree, which I don't think will look very natural. So instead, what I'm going to try to do is make that cut, but make them on a little bit of a sweeping angle. I'll still put the wooden inserts in between, and then when I put everything back together, that garland should have a little bit of a sweeping shape to it, making it look a little bit more natural on the tree. The second is the lights, and for that, I'm going to try to use colored epoxy. So it's going to start with drilling a whole bunch of holes randomly throughout our board, and then taking a whole bunch of different colored epoxies and filling them in. Once all those decorations are hung, then I can take my template back, put it on, cut out my Christmas tree shape, and I'll be good to go. From there, all that will be left would be to use a jigsaw to cut out the pattern, round it off, sand it up, finish it, and I've got a Christmas tree platter. Overall, that's the concept. Let's get to work. All right, so this project's going to be primarily made with walnut and maple, along with a bunch of random hardwoods that I'm going to use as decorations on the tree. We're going to start by squaring these boards up. cutting them down to about 1.5 inch strips. Then with the table saw still out, I'm going to cut a bunch of my hardwoods to about 1/8 of an inch strips. Then we got to start designing our tree. So I know the platter is going to be about 18 inches wide by 12 inches tall. I'll measure that out, putting 2-inch marks across the top and about 5.5-inch marks along the side. And that'll give me a little bit of a grid to make sure my tree is nice and symmetrical. My first tier of branches is going to go out about 4 inches from center. Then we're going to go 5 inches from center on the second, and then all the way to 6 for the base of the tree. Add a little shaping. And then cut out my template. I'll then take this to another sheet of paper where I'll trace out the left side, flip it over, trace out the right side. We've got a perfectly symmetrical Christmas tree. So here I'm just making sure that I cut the boards right and that my template will in fact fit on the amount of wood that I've got. I find that in woodworking, we all make mistakes. Whether you measure wrong or cut wrong, it happens. But you can always find ways to get creative. Let's get this thing glued up. So there's a reason that we cut these into strips just to glue them back together. One, it's going to give the board a little bit more of an interesting pattern with the grains going in a bunch of different directions. Secondly, having the grains go in different directions will ultimately help prevent some of the warping that is inevitable when working with wood. The next day, with everything dried, I run these things through a planer to get them nice and flat. After a couple passes, I've got some cutting boards. Let's turn it into a Christmas tree. So using a few of my strips, I'm going to start to figure out where I want these to go. I ultimately decided to put 5, sketched them out. Now it's time to make the cut. Hey, see what I'm getting at here? I think this may work. So it's during the glue up I realized I may have an issue, and that's that I'm gluing end grain wood to face grain wood. End grain wood typically doesn't glue up well because it absorbs a lot of the glue, and therefore doesn't bind the two surfaces very well. If this were anything other than a simple lightweight serving tray, I would probably rethink this idea. That said, I'm rolling the dice. I think it's going to work. So even though I'm going with 5 strips, I decided to start with 3, kind of figuring that it'd be a little bit of a challenge to get these strips in the cutting board and keep everything lined up. Once the glue dries, make a few more cuts. A little bit of hand sanding to smooth it out, but making sure not to change the shape. And then glue in my last 2 strips. So I realized that after I planed the board down, after the initial blew up, it took off about 1/8 of an inch of material. So I just used some 80 grit sandpaper to flatten that board out. Now it's time to turn this board into a Christmas tree. So I put my template back on top, just start sketching out where I envision the lights on this tree going. And once I'm happy with the layout, I drill out the holes for the lights. So I'm using packaging tape here to try to stop the epoxy from leaking through the board. And this is something I would probably do different if I were to do this again. I'm not sure if it's the tape that I used or the horrible job I did of putting the tape on, but it didn't work great. No chaotic leaks, but it definitely found a way to seep into those bubbles that you see there. And I ended up using more epoxy than I needed. So to color the epoxy, I'm using a powdered dye, and I was really happy with the vibrant color that it gave the epoxy. Here's a little Christmas trivia for you while I mix up these colors. What year were Christmas lights first invented? The answer? 1882 by Edward H. Johnson. The colors? Red, white, and blue. Time to start hanging the lights. I'm going to use a heat gun to keep the epoxy warm, which will help it flow a little easier and remove all the air bubbles. finally, it's time to turn this board into a platter. So using some double-sided tape, I secure my template to the board, drop my router bit just low enough so it's making contact with the wood, and then make my first pass. And you can see here how it removes material and leaves a little bit of a rounded edge. That'll be the side of the platter. I can then use that same process to remove all the material from the inside of the board. And very carefully, you remove the template, making sure not to break any. Little glue, couple hours. It's good as new. Let's get this thing cut out. So this is going to be your tray. So you can go whatever width that you want. I'm going about 1/4 inch, and I'm really just eyeballing it. I trace that shape around the tree, then use a jigsaw to cut it out. I spent a few minutes sanding it down to around 150 grit to get it relatively smooth, and then bring it over to the router table with a round over bit to soften the edge. Now, I've never had success using a router bit on maple wood before. I always get a burn mark, but a little hand sanding is able to remove that. I spent a little more time with the palm sander, getting it up to 220, a little bit of hand sanding, and before you know it, it's time to finish these things. I'm using a food-safe mineral oil to finish these. Applying the oil, letting it sit for a few minutes, and then wiping it off. This process gets repeated twice, and then these things are done.
Merry Christmas, baby. Reindeer's coming out to play. Santa Claus is packing the presents, making sure you've been behaving okay. Merry Christmas, honey. Yeah. The snowman's dusting off his hat, putting on the show for everybody, to give them a smile that lasts another year. There's something that happens when sleigh bells are ringing, when December ends, when the children are singing, yeah. It's Merry Christmas, baby. Ooh, yeah. There's room at the table for big and for small. All the fire is popping, the chestnuts are cracking, yeah. Merry Christmas, baby. Merry Christmas, baby.